The room was two bright white walls, polished floors light that left no shadow to hide in. Marcus Hale stood in the center, his faded uniform damp at the collar. Victoria Raines read from a sheet of paper, her voice flat, efficient, certain. No one spoke. Around the table, faces stayed, blank eyes lowered a chorus of silent judgment. A folder slid across the surface, the sound, sharp, final. Marcus's hands, rough, cracked from years of scrubbing other people's floors, tightened on his name tag before he unpinned it. He placed it on the desk with a quiet dignity that made the act feel heavier than a shout. He turned once his gaze sweeping faces that refused to meet his. As he left, his shadow stretched long across the sterile floor, dark as spilled ink. Out in the hallway, a man in a gray t-shirt and a baseball cap watched without a word. If you're watching this, don't skip the truths about to hit. The door to the factory swung open with a metallic sigh. Harlan Voss stepped in dressed in a gray t-shirt and a low-pulled baseball cap. Dust clung to his shoes, the kind of dirt that never reached executive offices. The air smelled of detergent, steel, and fatigue. A supervisor barely glanced up before pointing him toward the kitchen floor, Marcus's old post. The tiles were slick with grease. The mop leaned against the wall like a forgotten limb. As Harlan began to work, his reflection shimmered faintly in the wet surface, warped and dim. Around him, no one spoke. Machines hummed, people moved in repetition, eyes fixed on nothing. "Welcome to hell," someone muttered behind him, half laughing, half tired. Harlan didn't respond. He just lowered his head and pushed the mop forward, every movement sinking him deeper into the world he had built and abandoned. The hours crawled. Light flickered above the assembly line, blinking between white and yellow like a pulse too weak to sustain life. Workers passed each other without a word, their steps synchronized yet soulless. The rhythm of shoes against linoleum filled the void, a dull mechanical heartbeat. Harlan mopped in silence, watching faces drained of curiosity, voices swallowed by exhaustion. The place functioned perfectly, but it no longer breathed. He remembered the early days' laughter in the corridors, ideas born from chaos. Now, even air felt recycled, stripped of warmth. A man coughed. Another adjusted his clock-in card as if time itself were a burden. Harlan lifted his eyes to the ceiling where the lights trembled, struggling to stay alive. He understood then the company hadn't failed financially. It had bled out spiritually, and no one noticed the death. In the break room, steam from cheap coffee curled in the air. Two men leaned against the counter, voices low but sharp. Marcus Hale, one said, and the name cracked through the stillness. The other smirked, brought it on himself. Their laughter was brief, uneasy, like people mocking what they fear. Harlan froze. That name, Marcus, tugged at a memory buried beneath years of distance. The first man he ever hired. A handshake in a sunlit room, the promise of building something honest. He stared at the chipped tabletop, feeling a slow ache rise from somewhere deep. The guilt came quiet like a chill through the vents. He didn't defend Marcus. He didn't speak at all. He only watched the reflection of their laughter ripple across his untouched coffee, realizing how far he'd fallen from the man he once believed he was. She was quiet when she worked, careful, almost graceful, as if trying not to disturb the broken air of the place. Her name tag read Evelyn Cross. Small frame, soft eyes, sleeves rolled neatly to the elbow. During a short break, she told Harlan in a low voice, "Marcus once helped me when I fainted in the storage room. Stayed with me till I woke up." The memory flickered between them like a candle in fog. Harlan said nothing, only nodded, studying the warmth that somehow still lived in her. A man across the room overheard and muttered, "Don't bring him up again unless you want trouble." Evelyn smiled faintly, not in defiance, but in quiet belief. That fragile decency in her tone made Harlan pause mid-stroke with the mop. In a place ruled by fear and silence, she felt like proof that kindness, though buried, was not extinct. They sent him to clean the old warehouse, a place that smelled of metal dust and damp cardboard. Light flickered overhead, unsteady, as if the room itself were breathing shallow. The mop slid across the floor, leaving streaks of dull reflection. On the far wall, faded letters spelled "Integrity First," but years of grime had swallowed the first word. Only "first" remained a command, stripped of meaning. Harlan stood still, staring at the ruin of a promise he once made to every employee. His reflection shimmered faintly in a sheet of rusted steel, one man split in two, the builder and the betrayer. The air was thick with humidity and memory. He kept wiping through the stains never lifted. Every motion felt like penance, a wordless apology to a company that had forgotten what honesty used to sound like. The weekly meeting unfolded beneath lights too bright to be kind. Victoria Raines stood at the front, her smile rehearsed to precision. Words like responsibility and efficiency flowed easily from her lips. Around the table, employees nodded at the right times, their faces smooth, polished, identical. Harlan sat at the back unseen, watching how their expressions shifted only when laughter was required. The fluorescent glare turned their skin glossy like porcelain masks catching light. Beneath that shine, nothing moved. The applause at the end was automatic hands clapping out of habit, not conviction. Harlan realized then that the company had not been poisoned by greed or failure. It had been hollowed by performance. Everyone acted their part so well that truth no longer belonged anywhere in the room. The corridor smelled faintly of bleach and burnt coffee. Harlan was rinsing his mop when Evelyn appeared, glancing over her shoulder before speaking. "Don't talk about Marcus," she whispered. "Victoria hates that name." Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't. Fear had become the air everyone breathed here, so constant they no longer noticed it. Harlan studied her face. The fluorescent light coming through the barred window divided it cleanly in two. One side lit, the other lost to shadow. The line looked carved, as if the building itself wanted to separate courage from obedience. She stepped back, clutching her rag like a secret. "Just be careful," she added before walking away. The silence she left behind hummed with tension. Harlan stood still, water dripping from the mop handle to his boot, realizing the truth Evelyn had already learned: fear wasn't an accident here. It was policy. Lunch came like a ritual, the same every day. Managers at one table talking in low, confident tones. Janitors along the wall eating fast eyes down. The sound of metal forks against steel trays filled the room, a rhythm of submission. Evelyn sat alone near the vending machine, hands wrapped around a cup of soup. Harlan walked over and placed his tray beside hers. The motion was small but seismic. Conversations faltered, the room froze in mid-breath. Across the space, Victoria looked up, expression unreadable. Evelyn's eyes widened, not in fear, but quiet recognition. They ate without speaking, the hush around them louder than any argument. For the first time, Harlan felt the invisible line between power and humility bend, if only slightly. That silence was heavy, but inside it, something began to shift. After the shift, the building emptied into darkness. Harlan lingered, drawn toward the row of old lockers. The air smelled of iron and soap, the ghosts of 1,000 workdays. He found the one with a rusted tag, M. Hale. The door groaned open. Inside lay a small photograph, Marcus, his wife, 2 children, all smiling under sunlight that no longer existed here. Next to it, a mop with a broken handle wrapped in tape, worn smooth by long hands. Harlan touched it. The cold traveled up his arm like a current. This was no thief's locker, only a man's life compressed into objects too humble to defend themselves. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the vents. For the first time since arriving, Harlan felt something real beneath the grime, a pulse of decency, buried but still alive. The office was nearly empty when Harlan slipped inside. The hum of old computers filled the space with a tired rhythm. He pretended to tidy a stack of papers until he reached the personnel drawer. His fingers moved through the files until he saw it, Marcus Hale. The folder was thick edges softened by years of handling. He opened it. The first pages shimmered with praise. Employee of the Year, 5 years straight. Smiling photos, neat signatures, words of recognition. Then he turned the page. The next sheet was stamped in red warning. Theft suspicion. The contradiction felt surgical, deliberate. Harlan's hand tightened until the paper wrinkled. The ink smeared under his thumb. He stared at it, jaw still breath-even. Then he set the file back perfectly aligned as if nothing had been touched. When he stepped out into the hallway, his expression was blank, but his eyes, dark and steady, carried the weight of a coming storm. He found it by accident, an old frame shoved into a drawer beneath forgotten forms. The glass was cracked diagonally, the dust so thick it blurred the faces inside. He wiped it clean with his sleeve, and there they were, himself and Marcus, standing shoulder to shoulder in the bright beginning of everything. Behind them, a banner stretched across the wall, "Integrity Builds Legacy." The words now looked like irony carved in light. Harlan ran a thumb across his younger face, remembering the confidence of a man who believed systems couldn't rot if they were built on trust. The dust fell like gray snow covering the floor. The picture trembled in his hand, a small broken proof of what had been lost. He stared at it until his reflection merged with the cracked two halves of the same man split by time and guilt. He was leaving the corridor when Evelyn appeared again, moving quickly, her steps barely making a sound. "There's a camera in storage 3, she whispered close enough for him to feel the tremor in her breath. They forgot to delete the footage. Her words landed quietly, but they changed everything. The pale blue light from a vending machine fell across their faces, half color, half shadow. Evelyn looked around once, then walked away without waiting for a reply. The hallway swallowed her figure, leaving only the echo of resolve behind. Harlan stood still, his pulse steadying around the thought that truth might still exist, just buried under negligence and fear. He turned toward the dark stretch leading to the storage wing. The floor gleamed faintly beneath his boots, guiding him like a path he'd avoided too long. Without hesitation, he started walking. The air inside Storage 3 was thick with dust, the kind that clings to silence. Harlan brushed his hand across the monitor, leaving streaks of gray on the glass. When he pressed the power button, the old fan inside whirred weakly to life, groaning like something half-buried waking up. The screen flickered, then steadied. Marcus appeared, moving slowly, head bowed, bending to pick up a leather wallet dropped near the lockers. He turned it over, once checked inside, and placed it carefully into a metal box labeled "Lost and Found." Then he walked away. That was all. No theft, no hesitation, just decency recorded and forgotten. Harlan leaned back in the chair, the weight of revelation pressing against his chest. His face didn't move, but every muscle held the tremor of rage and relief colliding. The evidence glowed in the dark room, small and undeniable, a fragment of truth that refused to stay buried. He clicked through the footage again, frame by frame, until another image caught his eye. A man, Victoria's assistant, entered the same frame hours later. He glanced around, pulled open the box, and slipped a thick envelope into his jacket. No hesitation, no guilt, just routine. Harlan froze the frame. The man's face glared under the fluorescent light, sharp and greedy. For a long moment, Harlan stared at it, his reflection overlaying the image on the dusty screen. Two men, one stealing money, the other trying to steal back integrity. Outside, the air conditioning unit rattled, breathing shallow like a guilty conscience. Harlan exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the hum. Everything that had been twisted now stood straight before him. The theft, the lie, the ruined name, it was all deliberate. Justice wasn't missing. It had been buried alive, and now he knew who held the shovel. Harlan shut down the monitor and removed the tape, slipping it inside his shirt pocket. The air felt heavier charged. He could expose them now, end the charade, but he didn't. Not yet. Truth, he thought, means more when people reveal themselves first. Outside, the night had cooled. The factory lights threw faint halos across the asphalt. He sat on a bench behind the building, a glass of water resting beside him. The glow from the windows rippled in the surface, warping the light until it looked murky, unstable, just like the people inside. He watched it for a long time, listening to nothing but the quiet pulse of electricity through the wires. Patience was harder than anger, but it was cleaner. He would wait. The right moment would come, and when it did, every lie would collapse under its own weight. The next morning, the factory moved under its usual rhythm, clattering carts, tired footsteps, voices rehearsed into obedience. Harlan worked quietly, mopping near the glass office where Victoria Raines stood laughing too loudly at something her assistant said. She moved with the confidence of someone who believed control was permanent. Her tone, sharp, clipped, practiced. Her assistant avoided Harlan's eyes, his shoulders hunched as he signed the daily ledger, the pen trembling in his hand. Evelyn passed by carrying a stack of trays, her face calm, though her wrists were red from strain. No one complained. The hum of machines swallowed everything that might have sounded human. Harlan kept watching every gesture, every empty smile, every tremor of guilt hiding under professionalism. Power here wasn't loud. It was quiet, systematic smiling. The string of deceit stretched thin before him, and he could feel it one more pull and it would snap. The weekly staff meeting began with applause that felt pre-recorded. Victoria stood at the head of the conference table, her voice steady, polished. She spoke of discipline and performance of raising the bar. Words like these rolled easily off her tongue, smooth from repetition. Employees nodded at intervals, their faces drained of thought. Harlan sat at the far end, polishing the table where the light from above cut across his reflection. His own silhouette blurred with theirs, ghosts nodding in agreement. No one noticed him. No one wondered why a janitor was present. Victoria's laughter punctuated her sentences like glass breaking. Each smile she gave chipped away at the truth she pretended to protect. When she said, "We run on integrity here," Harlan's grip on the rag tightened until his knuckles turned white. No one flinched. The meeting ended in clapping, but the sound felt hollow, echoing through a company that no longer believed its own applause. After the meeting, Evelyn was summoned to Victoria's office. Through the glass, Harlan could see the exchange, Victoria standing tall, Evelyn small but unbent. The words were short. He could almost read them on Victoria's lips. Mention. "Marcus again, and you're done here." Evelyn's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't speak. She only nodded once, holding her composure. Victoria's hand pressed the door shut. The lock clicked clean final. That sound cut through the hallway like the strike of a gavel. Harlan stood motionless beside his mop bucket, the echo of that lock filling the space between them. The silence afterward was louder than shouting. Power didn't need volume. It only needed fear to do the speaking. When Evelyn walked out, her face was calm, her eyes dry, but something in her expression told him this kindness was no longer safe here, and cruelty had become the company's native tongue. During the afternoon shift, Harlan moved slowly through the storage area, pushing the mop bucket until it tipped, spilling a thin stream of chemical cleaner across the tiles. The sharp smell filled the air. Around him, workers paused, watching, then turned away one by one. "Not my job," someone muttered, already walking off. The liquid spread like a mirror, reflecting the overhead lights in warped ripples. Only Evelyn came over. She didn't ask why. She simply knelt beside him, grabbing another mop. For a few quiet seconds they worked side by side, their movements synchronized by something unspoken. When their eyes met, it wasn't surprise, it was recognition. Above them, the safety poster on the wall began to soak through with moisture. The red letters bled, and the word safety disappeared, leaving only first. Harlan stared at it, understanding without words. In a place where humanity had drained away, only one person still remembered how to care. Later that week, during a warehouse inspection, Victoria's voice cut through the air. "People like Marcus never change," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. The words struck like something physical, thin and sharp. The room stilled. Even the hum of machinery seemed to hesitate. Harlan stopped mopping and looked at her. For a moment, their eyes met hers, cold, his unreadable. Evelyn stood nearby, fingers tightening around the handle of her mop until her knuckles whitened. The silence afterward was heavy-drawn, taut between cruelty and restraint. Victoria smiled, slightly satisfied with her own certainty, unaware that her sentence had crossed an invisible line. The insult wasn't just to Marcus. It was to every decent person still clinging to belief. The air thickened around them. Harlan turned back to his work, but each motion of the mop felt like pushing through mud, each stroke erasing a little more of the respect he once had for this place. The next day, Harlan was cleaning near the surveillance room when he heard a voice from inside, low, nervous. "I thought you deleted that footage," the assistant said. His tone was strained, each word forced. "You said it was gone." The response was only a sigh, followed by shuffling papers. Harlan froze. The mop handle leaned against his shoulder, forgotten. Water sloshed in the bucket, spilling over the rim and onto the floor. The assistant turned briefly startled by the sound, but Harlan's posture was steady, his expression dull, just another janitor doing his job. The tension dissolved into a brittle silence. When they left, he crouched to wipe the spill through the floor was already clean. He wasn't mopping anymore. He was thinking. The truth had spoken for itself carelessly in the language of fear. They had confirmed everything. As the last drops fell from the mop, he knew now guilt wasn't hiding, it was walking freely in plain sight. The meeting began as they all did, routine rehearsed, drained of life. Victoria's voice floated across the room, polished and certain another speech about efficiency and discipline. Harlan wiped the table at the back, invisible as ever. Then a chair scraped against the floor. Evelyn stood up. Her voice was calm, steady. Marcus didn't do anything wrong. The words hung in the air like a spark refusing to die. No one moved. Victoria's smile froze, thin and sharp. "Excuse me," she asked, though she had heard perfectly. The silence that followed felt dangerous, like air before lightning strikes. Harlan looked up. For the first time in weeks there was light in his eyes. Evelyn didn't repeat herself, she didn't need to. Her single sentence had already cracked the perfect surface of fear that ruled the room. Victoria's gaze turned cold, but Evelyn's calm didn't break. In that stillness, a small fire began to burn, quiet, unwavering, alive. That evening, the punishment arrived disguised as formality. A folded letter sat in Evelyn's locker. Effective immediately reassigned to night shift. The words were brief, mechanical. She read them once, then folded her uniform with careful precision the same way she folded her emotions. Inside her locker was an old note yellowed at the corners. Marcus's handwriting, "Do what's right, even when no one's watching." She placed it over the reassignment slip and closed the door softly. Outside, the office lights glowed white and sterile. Behind the glass, Victoria signed the paperwork, her pen moving with detached ease. Rain tapped the windows, steady, indifferent. There was no drama, only the quiet cruelty of bureaucracy. Evelyn didn't cry. She just exhaled, long and slow, as if letting go of something that no longer surprised her. Justice had been delayed, but somewhere beneath the fatigue she knew it had not been denied. Harlan left his shift, late the factory, dim and hollow. Down the hall, under the tired hum of a flickering light, he saw Evelyn. Alone, she moved the mop across the floor, her posture straight, her pace unhurried. Each stroke left a trail of clean behind her, thin lines of order in a place that had forgotten what that meant. The echo of the mop against tile filled the silence like breathing. Harlan watched from the doorway unnoticed. There was no speech, no defiance here, only persistence, the kind that outlasts cruelty. He realized then that the company's real strength didn't live in its meetings or profits. It lived here in the slow rhythm of a woman cleaning what others had dirtied, doing her work as if the world still made sense. He turned to leave, the sound of the mop fading behind him, and felt the weight of humility settle in his chest. Morning light crept through the frosted window of the janitor's room. On the edge of Harlan's work table lay a folded piece of paper, the corners damp from the steam of the nearby sink. He opened it. The handwriting was neat, deliberate Evelyn's. "If no one speaks, what's right will die." The words were small, but they carried weight, pressing against him harder than any accusation he'd heard in that building. He folded the note, carefully slid it into his shirt pocket, and stood still for a moment. The fluorescent light above flickered, breaking and reforming shadows across his face. He looked up into its trembling glow, and something shifted behind his calm. The silence in the room thickened, charged with purpose. His fingers clenched around the edge of the table until his knuckles paled. He didn't need to write anything back. His answer was already written in the stillness he would act. By noon, Harlan walked to the security office. He still wore his gray shirt, the same one that let him move through the building unseen. The guard looked up as he entered. "I need to request a meeting," Harlan said evenly. "All staff, tonight." The man hesitated. "Reason?" Harlan's gaze stayed steady. "Internal security check." The words came out clean ordinary, leaving no trace of what they carried. Moments later, the request passed through Victoria's hands. She read it, nodded, and smiled with that hollow confidence of someone who believed every system answered to her. "Good idea," she said, signing without thought. When Harlan turned away, his eyes caught the row of monitors along the wall, the frozen frames of stored footage, the silent witness waiting. The stage was set. The players were already in place. All that remained was the curtain to rise. That night the building was quiet, its lights dimmed to a dull heartbeat. Harlan walked back to the old storage room where everything had begun. Dust floated like faint stars in the air. On the shelf sat the box marked with Marcus's name. He opened it. Inside lay a broken mop handle wrapped in tape, a small family photo, and a ring of tarnished keys. Harlan lifted the keys and held them tightly, their metal cool against his skin. Through the high window, the moonlight spilled across the clean floor, pale and forgiving. He closed his eyes and breathed a slow exhale that carried both anger and peace. Tomorrow, he whispered, justice walks in. The words weren't for anyone else, they were a promise to himself. In the silence that followed, the factory seemed to listen. Everything was ready. The truth just needed morning. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of the conference hall, striking the polished surface of the table where every employee sat waiting. The room buzzed with a low, nervous energy, shuffling papers, murmured guesses, the faint hum of the air vent. Then the door opened. Harlan stepped in. No uniform this time, just a clean gray shirt sleeves rolled a worn baseball cap held loosely in his hand. The noise thinned into silence. He walked slowly toward the front, his steps unhurried, deliberate. Victoria glanced at him, her brow furrowed, not recognizing the man who had spent weeks among them. A few whispers sparked and died in the hush. Harlan stopped at the center of the room, his eyes sweeping the crowd, the indifferent, the guilty, the few who still cared. He didn't speak right away. The pause stretched taut and fragile. Even the lights seemed to quiet themselves. He stood there motionless, the silence itself beginning to press on every chest in the room. When Harlan finally spoke, his voice was steady, stripped of disguise. "My name is Harlan Voss." The sentence landed like a shockwave. The air itself seemed to retract. A few gasps cut through the silence, one person's chair creaked, another's breath caught halfway. Victoria froze her smile, faltering, the color draining from her face. Harlan looked directly at her eyes, calm but unyielding. "And I've seen enough." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of months of neglect, deceit, and silence. No one moved. The janitor was gone. In his place stood the man who built everything they had desecrated. Every false gesture, every cruel whisper now hung between them, visible and undeniable. The authority in his tone wasn't loud, it was absolute, the kind that didn't need volume to command. The room had no place left to hide. Harlan reached for the remote. The monitor on the wall came to life, its glow cutting through the stillness. The first image appeared Marcus Hale bending to pick up a wallet, placing it gently into the lost and found box before walking away. Then another video, Victoria's assistant glancing around, pulling the same envelope from the box and sliding it into his jacket. The evidence spoke in light and movement. No words could soften it. A sharp inhale broke the silence, followed by another. Victoria stepped back, her face pale, her lips parting, but no sound coming out. Harlan stood, unmoving, his expression calm as the storm he'd unleashed. Justice didn't shout, it revealed. When the screen went black again, the silence it left behind was heavier than any verdict. It was the sound of truth reclaiming its place in a room that had forgotten it. The screen faded to black, but no one moved. The air was thick as if truth itself had weight. Harlan turned toward them, his expression still, his tone low and unhurried. "The mistake wasn't Marcus," he said. "The mistake was forgetting what it means to be human." His words landed like stone, quiet but immovable. Around the table, eyes dropped to the floor. The light from the windows divided the room in two, one half cast in brightness, the other drowning in shadow. Harlan stood exactly at that border, the split beam cutting across his chest. He looked at the faces before him, some ashamed, some simply hollow, and continued. Integrity doesn't vanish overnight. It dies when we stop noticing. No one answered. The silence was both punishment and confession. For a moment, the building itself seemed to listen, its cold metal walls absorbing the truth it had long refused to echo. In that stillness, guilt became visible. Minutes later, the door opened quietly, and Marcus Hale stepped in. The years had bowed his shoulders, but his eyes still held the same steady light. He froze when he saw Harlan, no disguise, no uniform now, just the man he had once called Sir. Harlan approached holding something in his hand, the old ring of keys. The sound of metal against his palm broke the silence. "This place belonged to you before it ever belonged to me," Harlan said, placing them into Marcus's rough, calloused hands. Marcus's breath caught his fingers curling around the keys as if they might vanish. His head bowed, eyes glistening. No applause followed, no noise at all, just a quiet exhale that seemed to cleanse the air. The guilt that had poisoned the room lifted, replaced by something cleaner, fragile but real. Dignity once stolen had been returned. Victoria stood motionless, her face drained of its practiced certainty. Then, slowly, she sank to her knees. "I was wrong," she said, her voice cracking under its own weight. The words didn't sound rehearsed this time. Harlan's expression softened, though his tone stayed calm. "You weren't the only one," he replied. "The fault isn't just in what you did, it's in what we allowed." The sentence settled between them, heavy and merciful. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, once his face free of bitterness. Tears slipped down Victoria's cheeks, catching the light, dissolving the last of her arrogance. The room stood silent, as if reluctant to interrupt. Harlan turned away, not in anger, but in closure. Forgiveness, he realized, didn't erase the past, it acknowledged it and moved forward. The storm had spent itself. What remained was only the quiet, after it cold, clean, and new. The meeting room felt different now, lighter, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. Harlan stood where Victoria once did, his tone, calm but firm. "This company isn't just changing its rules," he said. "It's changing its soul." Faces lifted toward him, uncertain at first. He continued, "Marcus Hale will return as head of security. Evelyn Cross, team leader." The words hung for a moment before they sank in. Marcus looked down, overwhelmed. Evelyn's eyes widened, disbelief giving way to quiet pride. Around the table, hands began to come together, not all at once, not loud, but honest. The applause grew slowly, like something fragile learning to stand again. Harlan didn't smile, but there was a warmth in his stillness. This was not triumph. It was repair. The company had been sick, and now for the first time in years it was breathing clean air. Outside, the glass morning light pressed against the windows and the reflection of the room looked whole again. The next day, sunlight poured through the high windows, landing across the polished floor. Marcus was back in uniform, moving the mop with steady rhythm. Beside him, Evelyn worked quietly, her sleeves rolled, her motions sure. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. Their reflections crossed in the shine of the floor, lines of light threading their silence together. Down the corridor, Harlan passed by the familiar gray shirt on baseball cap in his hand. He paused for a moment, watching them. There was no hierarchy in that image, only work dignity and peace. He nodded once almost to himself, then kept walking. Behind him, the sound of the mop continued slow and steady like the heartbeat of something newly alive. The building no longer felt like a monument to control. It felt human again. Everything at last was where it belonged. A week later, a new plaque hung on the wall by the main hallway, simple black letters on brushed steel. Respect isn't a rule. It's a choice. Workers stopped as they passed, reading it quietly. Some smiled faintly. Others just nodded as if recognizing a truth they had always known but forgotten to live by. Harlan stood a few feet away, arms folded, his gaze steady on the words. His reflection shimmered in the metal, merging briefly with the sentence. Behind his calm there was a trace of memory, the old sign from the warehouse, the one that had lost its first word until only first remained. Now the message was whole again. He turned slightly, watching the staff move through the hall, their steps unhurried, their laughter soft but real. The company wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. What mattered was that this time it had a conscience, and that was enough. For the first time in years, the lunchroom felt alive. The tables were no longer divided. No corner for managers, no wall for janitors. Everyone sat together, plates and laughter passing between hands once kept apart. Marcus told a story from the early days, his voice carrying warmth instead of resentment. Evelyn laughed softly, her eyes bright under the noon light that poured through the wide windows. Harlan sat beside them, quiet, his smile, faint but real. No speeches were needed, no declarations. The simple sound of shared conversation filled the space more honestly than any company slogan ever had. The sunlight spread across the table like a benediction, washing away the last trace of hierarchy. In that light, they were no longer titles or positions, they were people. And in that ordinary moment, the new beginning quietly took root. Days later, the story had already begun to travel. Emails arrived from distant branches, short notes, some formal, some personal. "Thank you for speaking up, Evelyn. You reminded us what's right." Harlan read one of them at his desk, the afternoon light sliding through the blinds and across the page. The sun caught the ink, making the words glow faintly. He set the letter down, a small smile tracing his face. Beyond the glass, the plant hummed with steady, honest work. What had started as a wound had turned into a message carried quietly from one place to another. Kindness, it seemed, didn't stay contained. It moved, unseen, unstoppable, through walls, through distance, through time itself. Afternoon light spilled across the desk, glinting off the old ring of keys Marcus had left behind. Harlan turned them slowly in his hand, the faint sound of metal echoing in the quiet room. Outside he could hear laughter, honest, unforced, the sound of a place healed. He looked toward the window, toward the people rebuilding what mattered. Kindness, he thought, is the only currency that never loses value. Titles fade, systems fail, power shifts, but decency endures. It costs nothing yet, it rebuilds everything. And for the first time, Harlan understood, leadership begins the moment you choose to care.